So I am Bror Saxberg, and we are going to be talking about hopes and reality of AI in education. I've got a terrific panel who will introduce themselves shortly, and we also have a really excellent whip, Ulrik Christensen, who will introduce himself when we get to questions. This is going to run probably until Senator Toomey gets here, about 20 minutes, a half an hour. And sort of midway into this, I'll shift to questions from the audience about AI and things like that. And we'll go from there. So why don't we begin by talking a little bit, introducing ourselves a little more, our organization and work, and kind of what we're doing with AI, whatever that is. We'll then talk about the definition of AI, because it turns out that's actually non-trivial, and a lot of people don't have that right. And then we'll see about hopes and realities and see how our time goes from there. Sound good, gentlemen?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm Bror Saxberg. I look after learning science at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. A long time ago and far, far away, I used to do human and machine vision research at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And in the 80s, it was a very different thing than it is now. Now, I'm looking at AI more as a consumer and kind of a grant maker. What can it do and how can it do it? So,
my name is Sergey. I am right now working on AI at Turnitin, which is a big ed tech company. I came to it via an acquisition of a startup I co-founded called Gradescope, which was founded by 3 Berkeley PhDs all working on AI. And the way we use AI is in grouping student answers together by content so that the instructor can grade much faster as they grade.
My name is Luis Fonan. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Duolingo. Before that, I was a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon. And Duolingo, we teach languages. It's an app to learn languages. We have a lot of users. There's a fun fact, there's more people learning languages on Duolingo in the United States than there are people learning languages in the whole US public school system. We have, and the main way in which we use AI, at least for the app, is whenever a user comes in, all users, usually for learning a language, the thing about learning a language is a lot of times you've tried before. So many people have different amounts of knowledge when they come in. The first thing we have to do is figure out what they know. And we try to use AI to figure that out. And soon after that, we try to give them exercises that are tailored to them. To basically bring them to the frontier and then try to expand that. That's probably a major use. Another one is whenever somebody makes a mistake, we try to figure out why they made a mistake and then give them an explanation for something that would make them not make that mistake again. So those are probably the major uses we have. So yeah, that's it.
So as you can see, we've got some seriously skilled practitioners to my right in the world of AI and so forth, and thank heavens that they're here to help. And I think the definition of AI and now and what it is and some of the consequences might be really valuable to ground us in then talking about hopes and realities. And so, Luis, why don't you start? If you were describing AI now, the way you think about it and use it, how would you describe what it is now?
It's a funny thing. I mean, we were talking before, and AI is an interesting thing that the definition has changed over time. Things that used to be AI are no longer really AI. For example, on Duolingo, we use speech recognition. That used to be a major AI theme. These days, it's just an off-the-shelf technology. We don't even consider it AI. It's just like, yeah, we use speech recognition. So it's changed over time. Right now, probably the main use for us is for things that we used to be able to do with heuristics, but then we optimize it through data. That's kind of the main thing. We have a lot of data on Duolingo. We have about 1 billion exercises are done every day by people in the app. And if we have our main use is, for example, we may assume that, I'll give you a quick example. The hardest thing about learning a language, by the way, is staying motivated. This is the hardest thing about learning a language. One of the ways in which we get to motivate you is by sending you a notification, every day to try to keep you to learn a language. The time in which we send the notification is actually tuned by AI. When we started, we just had a heuristic, which was, we'll send it to you every day at 5 p.m. That's not a very good heuristic. A much better heuristic is, we'll send it to you every day at the same time you used it yesterday. You used the app yesterday. That's a much better heuristic. But then we can actually train by looking at when people come and use the app and trying different times. We can actually train an AI system to send it to you at the optimal time, and that gets probably about 10% more people to come back every day. So this type of optimization is kind of the main use of AI for us, at least.
And Sergey, how about you? If you were describing AI to colleagues, friends, grandmothers, etc., how would you describe what modern AI is like in the world that you inhabit?
Right. I think AI is the most general term for intelligent machines, and it can encompass robotics, it can encompass heuristic-driven systems. To me, it's anything that behaves intelligently in some way. And then there's a subset of AI that's called machine learning, and that's mostly what people talk about when they talk about AI today. And I totally agree that AI is kind of an ever-receding term, which is why I think Michael Moe's slide that had the Loch Ness Monster, and it said AI in education, was pretty apt, because it always feels like you can almost see it, but then it disappears. And I think that's by design, because what we use the term AI for is stuff that doesn't work yet. Once it starts working, like speech recognition, or in your camera, faces are detected very well under all lighting conditions. But that's just part of the camera now, it's not AI, even though that was an active area of research at some point. But machine learning specifically, which is what most people talk about, to me is the combination of code and data. So in traditional software engineering, you write code that then executes and does a thing reliably, operates on some input, gives you some output. For machine learning, there's some code that you write, but then there's also data that comes from the past that the machine learns how to translate input data to output data. So the programmer writes some code, but then there's a large collection of data, and then the machine kind of takes both and then makes the decisions.
And how do you think about the relationship between AI and people, especially in the education world, the notion of teachers and teaching, and what's the role of those people? And you guys are working in kind of very different spaces. Duolingo is really trying to just be the service for learners and doesn't require other people involved. Gradescope and is by contrast a tool. How do you guys think about that, and how should folks be thinking about AI and teaching professionals and all that?
I mean, in our case with Duolingo, our goal is not to substitute teachers. That is by no means our goal. We actually we try to have an app that is where you can learn entirely just from it. But we know, I mean, we have done the studies. Duolingo plus a teacher is better than either one alone. And that's probably the best thing. There's many things that humans are much better at than computers. One of the main things, by the way, is motivation. Humans are actually quite good at motivating you, and also giving you explanations and stuff like that. So I think in general, the way we see it is the combination is a lot more powerful, and that'll probably be the case for the at least foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. And
for Gradescope, it's a tool for teachers, and we like to save teachers as much time as possible. And we definitely have no interest in replacing teachers. I think teachers are overworked today as things are. And so any time we can give back to them is just good for students, good for them. Just more generally, how should we think about AI and people? I think it really depends on the risk of AI making the wrong decision. And one, you can kind of think of it as how good is the AI relative to a human in terms of performance? And then how bad would it be if the AI made a decision? So a little 2x2 matrix. So for self-driving cars, the AI is not as good, or maybe getting to be just as good as a human at driving. And the consequences of making a bad decision are sometimes literally fatal. So for that reason, we've been very cautious about rolling out self-driving, and it's probably going to be a few years or maybe over a decade before it actually exists. But for stuff that the AI is good at and the consequence of being wrong are not so bad, at that point we should just automate it. So face detection or speech recognition, most of the applications, it's not so bad if it makes a mistake. And oftentimes the user interface can kind of pick up the slack and give you easy tools to correct mistakes that the AI made. In education, I think making a mistake that's student-facing is worse than making a mistake that's teacher-facing, because the teacher's an expert and should be able to correct it. So for us, we've been willing to roll out some AI features, but only so far as the teacher has a very good interface to review the results and correct the mistakes.
So be thinking about your questions about AI and such. We'll sort of open it up first to Ulrik and then beyond in just a couple of minutes. But let's move then. So if you look ahead a little bit, I actually really love this notion, defining AI as a thing you can't reach. That's like the unicorn, right? As soon as you can reach it, well, it's no longer AI. That's kind of a curious investment thesis for those of you who are investors, right? But if you were looking ahead over the next 3 or 4 years, let's say, or even 5 years, what kind of great services, great tasks in education do you guys see that AI is likely to reach beyond where we are right now? What kinds of things excite you about what could become normal for that? And I don't know, Sergey, you want to start?
For us, grading, I think, is a mechanical task that's very complicated to do, but it's not something that the human has to be involved in. So long term, I think all grading should be done automatically, and the teacher should spend 100% of their time interacting with students one-on-one, making sure they're motivated, making sure they can answer questions that the student might have. Grading, just if it were possible to automate at the level of complexity that good assessment really has to take place at, should be automated. So that's our goal.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts that you have?
Pretty similar. I mean, grading is a big thing for us. Being able to grade more complex things. I mean, right now with Duolingo, for example, we can grade relatively simple utterances that people give, but being able to grade an entire conversation would be a lot better. Another thing, I don't know if it's 5 years, but for us, conversational practice is a big deal. Being able to have an actual chatbot that you converse with. I mean, right now, if you've interacted with chatbots, they're pretty lame. Hopefully, in the next 5 years, they'll be a lot less lame. That's something we're interested in.
I think implicit in your answer, which is slightly different, is there's natural language processing used on print submissions, and then there's natural language processing plus voice recognition used for the language processing, all of which are really interesting. I also think there's all kinds of opportunities around things like timing and selecting the next intervention based on context. Mm-hmm. And the evidence that accumulates about, well, what does seem to work for which students and teachers in which context? And increasingly we are seeing you can't impose things from the outside. You have to actually kind of understand the inside and then come up with, well, what have others like that experienced that has been working for them too? Mm-hmm. Well, and so why don't we make a brief shift here? What do you guys think are some of the risks that need to be dealt with AI as it is now? And then we'll ask Ulrik to carry on and be mean-spirited about how awful we are in our thinking about this. So, Luis, risks of the AI side of things. What can go wrong?
Well, from the investor's point of view, investing in stuff that says education and AI probably usually goes wrong. But that's just from the investor's point of view. In general, in applying AI, I would say, it really depends. I mean, I really like what Sergey was saying. I mean, for some stuff, I don't think the consequences are all that bad. I mean, for example, telling a single student one single bad piece of feedback is not all that bad. I mean, maybe they'll get a little confused or whatever. On the other side, I mean, there's very high stakes stuff. For example, in Duolingo, we also have a high stakes test where we're trying to compete with the TOEFL test, where if we do the wrong thing, people won't get into college. That's actually high stakes. So yeah, there you just have to really make sure that your test is, everything that it does is very accurate. Yeah, I mean, there's also some risks about tuning things too much to certain populations. We suffer from that in terms of accents. A lot of times we do speech recognition, and we are much better at recognizing certain types of accents than others, and that just sucks. But yeah, I think that's another risk.
Mm-hmm. Sergey, what do you see?
I was going to say that the machine learning being a combination of code and data, even if your code is fully correct and as free of bias as you can make it, if there's bias in the data, then your machine will also have the same bias. So certain steps have to be taken in looking at the data and making sure that it doesn't have the type of bias that you don't want your prediction machine to have. That's one risk. And then I like what you said about as an investor, there's a huge risk in just when a company says they do AI, that's
Never believe them.
yeah, it's a big red flag. But we use the word AI, and I think the decision is conscious. Like, if we communicate with the user, I think that's a good term to use. So we say AI-assisted grading. We don't say, deep learning, whatever, because that's, why do that? But then internally, we try to be as specific as possible what we actually do. So.
Another area I think that may be able to be fixed, but is a challenge, is explanations. So you have a complex data-driven system that says, remove this person's left leg. And you might want to know why. Mm-hmm. And well, the box says, remove the left leg. All the data said, well, that's not terribly satisfactory for a physician, a nurse, or a family member. I'm a kind of a left leg using guy, so I'd like to know more about what's behind the curtain than the box says, right? And then of course there's the privacy questions, privacy issues, right? Mm-hmm. Of the data itself and where does it come from and how exposed is it? And then just massive trails of data that start to build up. How do you do that kind of thing? So then there's lots of other things there. But let's shift to questions from you guys. And let's start with Ulrik. And Ulrik, say a word about your background and your organization, and then let's engage, and then everybody else too. Raise hands and things, and we'll go from there.
Sure, thank you, Bror. So I'm Ulrik Christensen. I'm the CEO of Area 9. I've worked on adaptive learning systems and content production systems for years, among others with Stephen here, formerly from McGraw-Hill. It's kind of interesting to hear from two practitioners that the examples you're bringing up are student or teachers facing, and we also have one, which is the adaptive algorithm, that would be AI. But the vast majority of AI we've done for the last years, and we've done tons of it, are actually not of that kind. They are behind the scenes. It's like a tip of the iceberg. But what everybody always talks about is the AI that will change the life for teachers or for learners. But AI is much more like just a tool in the toolbox for a lot of us. I would be curious to hear you elaborate more on what frustrates you most when you say that these examples because I agree with it. When investors hear AI, they think, wow, that must be a magic thing. Mm-hmm. Try to think about as practitioners, what are the most frustrating things where people make completely unwarranted claims that people in the audience should be worried about?
Organizing all the knowledge in textbooks and serving up quiz questions on any topic from any textbook. Yeah, I'd be suspicious of that.
I mean, yeah, whenever somebody tells you, I have this tutor that is as good as a human, very suspicious of that too.
I think if it's for a specific, grades 1 to 3 Spanish learning, maybe that, that could be true. But the more general the claim, I think the bigger the red flag.
Another thing that frustrates me in particular is we've hired a ton of people with PhDs in AI, and one of the things that frustrates me is a lot of times, when you hire a lot of people with PhDs in AI, they're like hammers looking for a nail, where they're like, I will apply my AI on your thing.
Yes.
And a lot of times, a simple heuristic is actually, significantly better, easier to make, but about as accurate. So a lot of times it frustrates me when, the super sophisticated system can do 1% better than a simple heuristic, like send a notification at 5 p.m. or whatever. In this particular case, it actually does better than that. But we've definitely seen many cases where you spend a year working on something, and it's like, wow, my idea of doing it at 5 p.m. is about the same as the super sophisticated deep learning thing. And that's why I'm dubious a lot of times when people say, I have this deep learning mechanism that blah, blah, blah. You just, a lot of times just think a simple heuristic probably does about as well.
Mm. And is inspectable.
Oh yeah, it's inspectable, and not only that, it's not prone to bugs. I mean, it's like a simple heuristic is like a one line of code a lot of times, and it just works. Whereas these other things is 6 months later they tell you, it turns out the data we used was the wrong data, so something, and it's like, oh my god.
Right.
A phrase investors never like to hear.
Turns
out.
I think I want to add one more thing. As an investor, someone says they're doing AI, how can you evaluate that? I think data strategy is something that you should ask about. So if someone claims that they have a new AI that can do X, the first question should be, great, what data was it trained on? Where did you get the data? What is your mechanism for increasing the size of the data? And so on. because it's code plus data. So if the code's there, but the data's not there, and that's kind of I think the PhD in machine learning mistake, right? Very heavy on the type of code and the algorithm that you're going to use, very light on where the data is going to come from and how much time you're actually willing to spend labeling it and cleaning it and obtaining more.
And I mean, a way to make that even more explicit is, it's tempting, especially if you're running a company, to try to apply the algorithm to edge cases in the data set, because you want it to apply in as many places as possible. So it may actually be pretty good in the middle of the data set, but if you have a rare number of folks or instances that are at the edges of the data set, the company may still wish to claim, we do AI and it does all these things as well. Mm-hmm. And so the actual errors you make may vary dramatically depending on where you are. So that question of what's the data and how are you going to make it even better and bigger, mm-hmm. Where does it apply and how do you know?
Right.
Those are key when things are grounded in the data. So question, or do you want to have one more, Ulrik, and then we'll open it to the audience. Go ahead, one more.
Another thing I think that is important of what I picked up from what you were saying is, as practitioners, and I agree with that from our perspective, AI is much more often used as something that accentuates and enhances human decision making, much rather than that magic thing that shows up. And if we look at medicine over the last 30, 40 years, are we using more doctors or less doctors than we did before? And do we have more technology, more in general, not just AI, but all the other things that makes the value of every minute delivered by a doctor more valuable? It does, and we need more. So it actually has increased productivity dramatically, whereas the discussions we have right now is in 1984, Orwell's, teachers are going out of fashion, are we going to substitute the entire world with AI? What do you think of that? Are you using this as tools or are they goals in themselves?
Yeah, 100%. AI, artificial intelligence, but then some people say IA, it's like coming up at the same time, intelligence, augmentation. Yeah. So that's human intelligence augmented by a machine. That's definitely the way that we like to think of how to use AI.
I would like to make a little distinction. I think in developed countries like the US, I just don't think teachers are gonna go away anytime soon. I don't know why we're even talking about that. But I think in many developing countries where there's just no access to teachers, we have to deal with that a lot. English teachers in many countries don't know English, period. So in those cases, I think really, we've taken it upon ourselves to just be a full solution for people. If they have just no access to a teacher, well, you're just gonna be better than nothing. So I think it really depends, but I'd say in developed countries, teachers are not going away anytime soon.
Let's take at least a question or two from the audience if we have time, please.
But it's all about the economy, right?
Exactly, right.
So AI question. Many of us worry about what our AI devices are doing, what data they're collecting, how they're using it. I'd love to hear from the two of you with respect to how you think about the data that you collect about specific individual users. We all know there's plenty of policies out there that say you should only collect as much data as you need to actually accomplish the task. At the same time, you're a startup thinking about future innovations that you might do, collecting the past data that might help you with that. How do you think through that space? What experiences do you have? What best practices can you suggest for others? I'd love to hear that. By the way, I'm Mike Smith, from Harvard.
We collect, in some ways very little data, in some ways a lot of data. We collect very little personal data. We really, with Duolingo, all we get is your email. You don't even have to give it to us. You can just make a fake email. Other than that, we do keep a profile for you, and then we keep, the thing we do keep is basically every single exercise you've done, what answer you gave, how you got it wrong, how you got it right, the timing of all that information, et cetera. And then we use that to try to teach you better. That's the main piece of information. We don't, at least for the main Duolingo app, we don't consider this particularly sensitive, but we do, we obviously keep it pretty guarded and we don't share it with anybody. One of the things is we've had to deal with GDPR, which is the European Union, privacy things. That's actually been really good for privacy worldwide, because now that we did all this stuff for GDPR for the European Union, we just apply it everywhere else, pretty much. Thank you, European Union, for pushing everybody to do that. There's a range of, as a startup, there's a range. At the very beginning, my guess is most startups are just not doing all that much to protect the data. By the time you cross a certain a certain point, I think you kind of do have to start doing things. I mean, we do get GDPR, inspectors actually coming and asking us questions, et cetera. So by the point where we are, where we have hundreds of millions of users, we basically have to do a lot to protect your data.
Sergey, how do you think about the data question?
It's very important to keep data secure. I mean, that's one of the things that's an existential risk to a young company. Even the perception that you're not being careful with data can really sink a company. So this was one of the things we were paranoid about from very early days. We have data about how answers are graded. And when I say graded, I usually mean with feedback. Well, it's the way the instructor decides to grade, but it usually involves giving more detailed feedback. It's not just a grade. It's not just 7 out of 10. It's -2 points for a reason of some sort. We keep that data. We use it to train machine learning models. By FERPA, the data does not belong to us. It belongs to the institution where the instructor works. If the institution requests us to delete the data, we delete the data. And importantly, I think, we retrain the model. So the machine learning model is code plus the data that it was trained on. So let's say I trained it on some amount of data that I then later had to delete because the school didn't want it on the services anymore. That data might live on in some way in the model. And so for that reason, it's important to regularly retrain, or at least when a certain trigger happens, to retrain the model such that the data that was deleted is no longer part of the trained model.
Another question? Let's try that side. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So one thing I always worry about is AI replacing teachers' interaction with students or teachers' interaction with students' work. So I spend a lot of time teaching my daughter math, for instance. If she doesn't know how to do 1/2 plus 1/3, it could be because she doesn't understand the rule, could be because she doesn't even understand fraction, or it could be because she's just careless all the time. So even something like you guys talking about grading students' work, something as mundane as that, if teachers stop grading students' work, they actually lost the signal of why they're not working and why they're not getting the concept. So to some extent, we're taking away the data that is feeding into the teacher's brain as a system of helping to teach the student better. So I'm wondering about how you guys think about that implications of AI and how they may, unintentionally making teachers less effective because of that.
Sergey, yeah, that might be.
I think, I may not understand the question correctly, but we actually, the Gradescope interface basically almost requires a reason for grading an answer a certain way. So there's got to be a reason for saying there's -2 points or +3 points or whatever it is. That reason is then recorded. That is part of the data. So any kind of machine learning we develop will also have that reason. It's possible to kind of explain why we're given the score that we do.
I think the interesting thing she's asking is the flip side, which is if we are so efficient that we are removing the grading task from teachers, does that also mean we're not giving a training set to teachers?
Right.
And so they're not seeing the variety of things that go wrong with students in their community. And it's a fun idea that, the training sets apply to HI as well as AI, right? Human intelligence as well as artificial intelligence. And so that's actually a really interesting question.
Yeah. I said, we should automate all grading, and so maybe we shouldn't automate the data that you get from the act of grading. So the way you could do that is receive a report from all of your students where their answers were graded mostly automatically, but the reasons for why they lost points or earned points are presented to you in some kind of report. So you can see an actionable report. This doesn't exist. I'm just saying in the future, the teacher could receive an actionable report and saying, on this concept, your students didn't seem to really understand it. Here's the evidence for why we're saying this. Like they missed these points on these questions, and maybe even point the teacher to ways to improve the teaching in the future.
There's another way to look at this too is If you focused on the teacher training problem, then the nature of the examples you would want them to work on should be presented at a different timing and pace than the real world presents them to you. So in other words, a new teacher learns from every single thing they do, but an experienced teacher doesn't learn from every single grading experience they have. So that you may actually want to have an actual staged exposure of teachers to grading tasks that now it matches their skill level as graders, so that they get the time benefits, but they also get the skill building benefits. But I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know if Luis, you have any thoughts on this or comments on this?
I mean, the way we see it, first of all, Duolingo is not really specifically for schools, even though we believe we're used in about 25% of language classrooms worldwide. The way we see it is, I think we should try to get the teacher to spend most of the time on what they're really necessary for. So I think generally what we've heard from teachers when they use, for example, our app, is that they are able to concentrate on the things that they think they're better at. And I think it's been a net positive. I mean, and also being able to do studies that show that actually, the teacher plus your tool is better than the teacher or than the tool itself is usually a good thing.
Good. Another question? Somebody already have a mic? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I wonder if you all would comment on a concern of mine, which is the capacity for AI to codify human bias while absolving the humans of the moral dimensions of their decisions. I'm thinking in education of two scenarios immediately. For example, close to where we are right here, there is a teacher looking out at a room full of students, none of whom could be the child of her body, deciding that they are not capable of addressing the high standards she's now responsible for teaching. And in a way that she considers loving, is stripping out rigor so that they don't have to struggle, and not having to struggle also means they don't get the opportunity to learn. If an AI did that for her, then we missed the opportunity to get her to examine why it is that she's using a little data and a lot of bias to do that to her class. On the other hand, on the natural language processing sort of things, first of all, thank you for Duolingo. My trips to Brazil are much better now. I appreciate that. But it seems to me that the natural language processing seems to be really good at having college-educated American speaking standard English communicate with a college-educated Spaniard speaking standard Spanish. That's less useful to an American school where neither of those languages is much in evidence at a PTA meeting in some instances, and therefore the AI has the capacity not to reflect the way humans do speak, but to dictate the way humans should speak, and there's a moral dimension to that we don't sometimes think about.
I think the foundational observation is human life's messy and there's all kinds of problems that we should struggle to solve. And once a machine takes over some part of human life, we tend to treat it as fixed, and that's just the way things are done, and we stop thinking we can change it. So I think that's something definitely to watch out for. Just like the machine is not the end-all be-all of decision-making, and it can be changed. And there's going to be bias in the data, so we just have to be watchful for it. It's just, that's as hard as any other part of human life. We just have to remember that it's not any easier.
Luis?
I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I think we try really hard to, one of the things with Duolingo, we try to really be appealing to everybody, whether you're college educated or not. And we try really hard to teach you language at the level that you're going to need it. But I think in general, yeah, this is a good question.
And I think it reinforces how we're not taking away the key need to understand what can teachers really do to optimize the ways forward, both academic and non-academic, for all their kids. That when a teacher kind of allows him or herself to say, well, the box said, so, what? then you have a problem, because you have the opportunity for the teacher to go beyond what the box says, and to even question why the box is doing what it's doing, and augmenting and adding as needed. I mean, every kid is a weird, this is the Todd Rose thing, every kid is a weird little bundle of contradictions, and the AI is going to smooth out a lot of those, whereas teachers can help to go back into the details of individuals, and so you don't want to lose that skill building. Another comment or thought from anything over here? We'll go, how about the back there? If there's a mic that could go back to her.
This may not be entirely fair, but you all are closer than most of us to where you think and how you think AI will evolve over the next decades. So for those of us who are thinking about PK-12 to 12 or even higher education, how should we be thinking about changing how we're educating students now for the future in which they will live and need to succeed?
Let me tell you exactly what you need to do to educate your students. I'm kidding. I don't know if I have anything great to say here. I think generally, one of the things that I wish, this is just from, in terms of hiring for us, one of the things that I wish people had a lot better understanding of is statistics. So if you could all teach more statistics to people, I would love that. I don't know what you think.
I think a lot of things have stayed the same 100 years ago, 200, 1,000 years ago. Steak and red wine still exists. So I don't know how different it would be. I mean, there is going to be a world after human-level AI, which is maybe what some people mean when they say AI. They mean human-level AI, generally capable. That is an undetermined number of years away, probably at least a decade, but maybe 100 years, maybe 20 years. No one knows, right? And that would be a different world. But until that world, I don't think it's going to be that different. So data literacy and more math is probably the best we can do.
I'd actually probably add to that, another way to look at the question is, what value do people add to a workplace? What's the point of people? If you have AI doing the purchasing in an optimal way, and you have AI building the stuff that's getting purchased in an optimal way, what are we for? Well, the thing that we are really good at is giving value to each other, and to each other's struggles, and life stages, and work, and human decisions. So one argument, in addition to preparing students for a world of technology and all that, is to start much earlier in helping people become empathetic, learning about each other, communicating with each other, because it's going to be a long time before the machines are able to do that. And so weirdly, it's very much, I think what Sergey said, focus on some of those older things. I think that's really valuable, because the simple stuff is going to get more or less replaced, and it'll leave this really important human-to-human problem solving and connections still to work. Another question?
Thank you. Stephen Laster from Lyceum, but in a prior life did a lot of work in this area, and commend you guys for the work you're doing. I've seen your work, I've seen Ulrik work, and others, and with many millions of students in many thousands of schools. If we were at this conference or similar conference 6 years ago, there would have been a non-pragmatic discussion about AI, far different from what you guys have beautifully framed. And it was a discussion about how AI does replace the teacher, and there was a bit of overhype and overreach. That started a chain reaction, certainly in higher ed, and I think in K-12, with real faculty suspicion because of that overhype. Some in our sector are trying to buttress that with a drive towards standards around AI in education, standards around the data input, standards around the output, and more clarity into the machine so that they can have comfort with what it's doing. There's a tension in that in terms of innovation and commercialization and open-end standards. And I would welcome your thoughts on whether those standards are helpful, whether they're harmful for innovation, and how you view that debate. Thank you.
You may, I mean, Sergey may have better answers for that. I mean, I'll just be very blunt here. We essentially ignore all of that. We are not, for us in particular, we're trying to reach the end consumer. We know that a lot of schools use us. We get contacted by a lot of schools who say, actually, our whole school would like to use you, but you have to do this one little change for you to be compliant with whatever. We don't respond. It's just not, we have hundreds of millions of users here. There's one school with 400 users somewhere. We're just not going to deal with you. That's the reality of a company like ours. We just don't have the bandwidth. I mean, we have 250 employees. We don't have the bandwidth to make sure that we're compliant with whatever the state of Indiana wants to do and versus the state of California or something. We just don't have the bandwidth. I think maybe companies that are more geared towards K-12 do spend a lot of time, but my sense is that really slows you down if you're trying to be an innovative company.
We mostly address higher ed needs, so we don't have that much experience with K through 12. I think it's important I think you can't regulate something that doesn't exist. It just doesn't make sense to do that. You can't do it. You don't know what the parameters are because they don't exist yet, so how can you regulate them? But I think you can mandate that any potential solution has to be approved by people or has to be developed talking to experts, and I'm fully in support of that. So without saying anything about how the technology should operate, you can say that the technology should be developed consulting with experts, and that would be great.